The California Dreaming podcast is brought to you by Blueberry. There is more to making a podcast than just talking into your mic and hitting publish. You're going to need a little bit more than that. And I'm talking about reliable hosting so your time can be spent working on your show. You want accurate download numbers, you want to see the audience that you're reaching, and you're going to want a web page that is simple and easy to work with. That's why I've chosen to use Blueberry. It's simple media hosting and fully integrated WordPress website. It can't get any easier, especially for someone like me who knows nothing. If you host a show or you're thinking about starting one, visit www.orbitaljigsaw.com/dream to give it a try for a month for free. Their dedicated support team will be right there to help you every step of the way. And with 1 month for free using our promo code DREAM, you've got no more excuses to start up that podcast that you keep talking about starting. There are a number of ways that you can support California Dreaming. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can spread the word about the show. You can recommend us in podcast and true crime fan groups. And you can leave the show a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or whichever platforms that you listen to the show on. And if you'd like to go a little above and beyond in helping out the show, you can support us on our Patreon. You can gain access to at least one exclusive episode per month, and there are currently more than 50 episodes that you can binge. And don't forget, we're in the middle of a really, really good series that's available only on Patreon. So it's a pretty good deal for starting at just $1. In addition to that, there are about 8 premium episodes available for supporters at the $5 and above tiers. But the series that we're currently in is available for everybody. If you're unable to sign up for a monthly subscription to Patreon, then you can help out with a one-time donation to the show through our PayPal using our email, californiapod@gmail.com. Every little bit helps in keeping us going, keeping us moving forward, keeping us creating great content, and keeping us ad-free. So thank you. If I had one takeaway from my experience making this podcast, it's that you never know what a killer or an assailant is going to look like, or who he or she is going to be. Sometimes they are the unlikeliest of individuals, people who have just been garbage human beings from the very beginning until they reach the point where they finally killed somebody. Then there are those who people will say they would never have thought it possible. So-and-so would never even hurt a fly. You know, we've heard it all. And then I thought, okay, I'm going to look back at some of the stories that we've covered on this show and see which one of them and when it happened, if at the time it took me by surprise. And really, once you find out the ins and outs of any given case, I've really come to find that very little surprises me anymore. People are just capable of stuff. Lately, there's been a lot of talk about Chris Watts. Since many of us have had a chance now to watch that new documentary on Netflix and talk a little bit about it in our group. And I have to be honest with you, after I did that short bonus on the murders of Shanann, her 2 girls and unborn son, I had to stay away from delving into that case too much. I kept hearing all about what a domineering person Shanann was and how she was somehow to blame for the crumbling of the marriage, which was apparently the precursor to what was to come. That Chris Watts was a meek pushover and she drove him away and drove him to committing these crimes. That nobody could have ever guessed that he could have done something like this to not only Shanann, but also to his daughters and his unborn son. That he was a great dad, he was so loving. Yeah, this is the guy his own daughter sang about and called him a hero. He dumped them into an oil tank after he suffocated them or strangled them, whatever he did to them. Never would have expected him to do something like that, they say. Well, sadly, the crime in and of itself is shocking on many levels, but the fact that it was committed by a lying, cheating pile of human garbage like him, I don't find so shocking anymore. The fact is, everyone is capable of murder. Whether or not we choose to carry that out is another thing. That's just one of the many lessons that we've learned as we go through these stories week in and week out. But I'm talking about how we see things through the lens of the year 2020. This pandemic has been like one big, huge, massive reality check for the entire world. And after this, I don't think many of us are going to be really, truly shocked very much anymore these days, considering what's been going on for the last 7 months. But in years past, there have been crimes that grabbed headlines because of it being so unbelievable as to what was being said in the media. I just listened to a podcast, I think it was Dateline or something, and they covered the Menendez brothers. Eric and Lyle shotgunned their parents to death in 1989 as they sat in their Beverly Hills home watching TV. On the podcast, it was remarked that this was a crime unlike anyone had ever heard of before. 2 rich kids murdering both of their parents in a bloody ambush in Beverly Hills. It was a thing that people found compelling and shocking. Nowadays, though, a rich kid or rich kids killing their parents, I don't know if we'll find it as shocking anymore. Perhaps we're desensitized. The Menendez brothers' trial was called the first major televised courtroom event. The nation was watching, possibly even the world. Today, we still may be glued to the TV or to the internet if something like this happens here again, but I don't think it's going to have the same impact as it did 31 years ago. So when our story today took place, and I vaguely remember this one, it was in my neck of the woods in Southern California. When the story started being dubbed the honor roll killings, it was a case that flew in the face of everything everyone ever thought of the quintessential Asian American straight A student. The children of immigrants who came to America chasing the dream of success and achieved it. Personally, having grown up and being raised in a predominantly Asian community, I was not going to be shocked by the straight A having Asian kid getting into some serious trouble. But the Southern California community and the public in general, they were pretty surprised to hear what these kids did when this case started making the rounds in the news. And yeah, admittedly, Asian American kids being these super smart honor roll students achieving grade point averages higher than 4.0 with their sights set on attending the most prestigious colleges in the country might be way overgeneralized. It's a stereotype, but it's one that has seemed to have stuck over the years. So when the news broke that these kids were in some serious trouble, people were like, wait, what? Not these kids with the good grades from the fancy neighborhoods in Orange County and the big houses. But to that I say, oh yes, these kids. They may be good students. They may come from good homes and wealthy families. But that sometimes translates into overindulged, spoiled, and entitled. And we're going to talk about them. A group of them. Some friends who went to some good schools and had some nice GPAs, and they drove fancy cars and lived in big homes. And they also behaved badly. In this 163rd episode of California Dreaming, the tale of honor roll students who kill. Those who knew Stuart Tay, depending on who you asked, had some mixed feelings about the 17-year-old Foothill High School senior. Administrators and staff at the school said he was quiet and down-to-earth, soft-spoken. He had a laid-back type of personality who excelled at just about every aspect when it came to academics and extracurriculars. But there were others who knew him that said that they had heard that he had another side to him. a side that extended beyond typical teenage mischief, activities that crossed over into serious criminal behavior. Nonetheless, the feelings about this whole case were overwhelming when the details of exactly what happened on the night of New Year's Eve of 1992 sent shockwaves through the affluent Orange County, California community in which Stuart Tay was raised. In an interview with A Current Affair, a member of the Foothills High School security staff described Stuart, a former Boy Scout, as having a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde type personality, a double life, so to speak. You could talk to one person who was friends with Stuart, and they would easily describe him as a good friend, a nice guy, totally respectable, not a bad thing to say about him. And then you can go and talk to another person who was friends with him, and they would just as easily say that he was manipulative with a strong urge for money, power, and control. Again, it doesn't surprise me. People can be different depending on who they're hanging around with at any given moment. Stuart Tay was apparently a chameleon like this. He had friends who were headed to the Ivy League colleges with whom he was a member of a number of campus clubs geared towards community service. He was on the honor roll with these students. They were his peers. And he also had friends that were purportedly members of notorious Asian street gangs. I can't say how difficult or how easy it was for Stuart to play both sides, but what I can see is neither side of Stuart being truly genuine. Because no matter where he was putting on a show for whichever audience he was playing to. Stuart Tay had aspirations to follow in the footsteps of his dad, Dr. Alfred Tay, who was a well-known physician with a practice in Orange County. I looked him up, and he is still actively working as an obstetrician and a gynecologist. The Tays, mom and dad and Stuart and his younger sister Candace, lived in an 11-bedroom, 8,000 square foot, multi-million-dollar custom home in Orange, California. And Orange, if you aren't familiar, is a city nestled in the northeastern part of Orange County. While the city itself doesn't stand out as being particularly luxurious, there are sections of it, especially if you wind your way up through the hills. It's where you'll find the nicer, more exclusive neighborhoods. Stuart, at his high school, was the founder of the Asian Club, as well as a member of the Key Club. He was on the honor roll. He consistently maintained a 4.0 grade point average, and his application to Princeton and several other universities had already been submitted, and it was his dream to go to Princeton, but all of that at the time this is taking place was pending acceptance, which Stuart, of course, was confident that he would be heading east to New Jersey come the following fall, considering his stellar high school resume. But in talking about Stuart, no matter how many glowing things people had to say about him, it seemed like everything had a little asterisk next to it. He was a good kid, but the clothes he wore, the music he listened to, didn't align with the academic standout that he was. Stuart had somewhat of a dark side to him. He talked to his friends about living fast and dying young, but many wrote this off as the musings of a somewhat complicated teenager. So nobody was really surprised when they began to hear rumors about Stuart having been involved in illegal activity. He talked about it to his friends that he was a computer genius when it came to hacking, that he was involved in counterfeit money, counterfeit credit cards, and identifications. Whether this was real or fantasy, nobody doubted that he at least aspired to those things. He liked talking about those things. Until he got a new car for his birthday in December of 1992, he used to tear into the school parking lot in a convertible Mercedes-Benz that belonged to his mom and dad, just to make sure everybody knew that he had arrived. Rumors at school were that Stuart carried nothing smaller than $100 bills in his wallet. But those who would say that they were Stuart's true friends insisted that he was nothing like that, and if anybody believed it, then they did not know the real Stuart Tay. Yes, he was a little bit full of himself, a little bit arrogant. He was more talk than anything else, though. The real Stuart was a good kid who was a trusted friend, a loving son and brother, and most of all, he was known for being exceedingly polite. The big talk was nothing more than that, just talk. He would never, he could never. Of course, you and I, knowing what we know about human nature, we're not going to buy into that one bit. Like I said in the beginning, human beings are capable of just about anything, including being two different people in terms of who they present themselves as being to their classmates and teachers versus who they make themselves out to be to those they conduct business with outside their everyday normal lives. Friends said Stuart was not like his peers. He didn't go to any parties, he didn't drink, he didn't smoke, and they said that he spent his weekends working with a club called Safe Rides, which what they were doing was picking up classmates who had been out doing those exact things to make sure that they got home safely. Stuart was even known to at times wear suits and ties to school and was often the first one to help tutor his friends, even going so far as to help them compile study guides and create flashcards. He was that student that not only gave presents to his teachers when the occasion called for it, he also gave presents to his guidance counselor. He'd even once taken his English teacher out to some fancy brunch at the Ritz-Carlton in Dana Point, California. That teacher told the Los Angeles Times that Stuart was a complete gentleman that day, and very, very charming as they sat and talked about Stuart's future plans and how he had submitted his applications to Princeton, UCLA, and Berkeley. The teacher mentioned that when she had him in honors English, he excelled by leaps and bounds ahead of most others in the class. So much so that not only did he often lead many of the classroom discussions, at times he seemed like he was so restless, bustling with all of this intellectual energy. Stuart's mom had loaned him her car for that brunch date because it was so much nicer than his. When it came to Stuart's family, you could set your watch by him. He was home on time after school every afternoon and never missed the family dinner. He kept up with his chores and his responsibilities, and by all accounts, he was very respectful to his family. Classmates and teachers went on and on about how fiery and enthusiastic Stuart was in class, that he was sharp and quick-witted, and he could debate nearly anything endlessly. He was prepared for anything. Stuart's future was certainly bright. And now, dreamers, I can appreciate the intellectual side of Stuart Tay here. He is not unlike many of the children of successful Asian American immigrants who expect no less than excellence from their children. And without debating the guilt or innocence of the person I'm about to reference here, but when it comes to Stuart Tay, I get a little bit of an Adnan Syed vibe from him. You know, he was also the son of immigrants. He was popular and well-liked. He was smart and did well in school. But Adnan also liked to skirt the strict rules his parents had for him, particularly when it came to dating Heyman Lee. I can't recall if Adnan wasn't allowed to date her because she wasn't Muslim, or he wasn't allowed to date her because he wasn't allowed to date. I tend to think the latter because I recall him saying at some point that he needed to make sure that when Hay was in his car that she didn't shed any of her long hairs in the passenger seat. Otherwise, his parents would be on to him. But Adnan, too, did what he wanted to do behind his parents' back, but managed to keep up his grades and everything else. Stuart strikes me as being similar to that. Obviously, he was an excellent student. There is no taking away from that. But there was something about all that achievement that simply wasn't quite enough for Stuart. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was that bored rich kid syndrome. Whatever it was, Stuart wanted something a little more exciting to do, something more exciting to talk about other than his SAT scores. Of this story, W. Somerset Maugham was quoted in a 1993 Time magazine article as having said, quote, "It is an illusion that youth is happy, an illusion of those who have lost it." The article continued, "That illusion has been fading, especially in one of the most prosperous and conservative corners of the country, home to the fantasy capital of America, Disneyland, and to a host of quieter fantasies as well. For residents of Orange County, the most perishable myth would seem to be honor students, computer geniuses, and star athletes would make headlines only for their remarkable achievements, never for their ruthless crimes." Robert Chan was an 18-year-old student at Sunny Hills High School. And if you're from the area, then you know Sunny Hills is a prominent school located in the northern part of Orange County in the hills of the city of Fullerton. Robert was a popular, well-known young man, also a senior, whose academic achievements rivaled those of Stuart Tay. Other students and classmates of Robert, their parents would see him as an example of what their own children should aspire to. He was on the academic decathlon team. He had been named Student of the Month. He was one of Sunny Hill's best and brightest, with aspirations, also like Stuart, to either be a physician, an entrepreneur, or an actor. Robert was a shoo-in for class valedictorian and was also most likely headed to an Ivy League the following fall. There was, however, something else that Stuart and Robert had in common. They seemed to yearn for a little bit more than the academic accolades, the perfect GPA, the high SAT scores. They seemed to want to be respected for more than that, to be known for something more edgy than being high achievers. Stuart was known to tell people that he was somewhat of an up-and-coming crime boss in and around the Orange County area with the agent gangs and whatnot, and his specialty was trafficking firearms. Similarly, Robert also bragged to his friends that he too had gang ties and that he was all about that life. But it seemed as though both of them were, for the most part, exaggerating. They both lived pretty cushy, spoiled rich kid lives in their fancy homes in the rolling hills of North Orange County. Stuart's house, along with its 11 bedrooms, also had a large pool and a tennis court, while Robert's home was in a new, quiet, well-manicured housing development in Sunny Hills, one of the most affluent areas in Orange County. So from the outside looking in, it seemed like these were just two kids blowing a lot of hot air, being boastful, just lots of talk, running their mouths to impress their friends. It's a thing that lots of people do, brag about stuff to come off as more impressive. And seeing as though it sounds like Stuart and Robert were both cut from the same cloth, you'd think that they would have known each other for quite some time by the time the story took place, but they really didn't. They were not acquainted with one another until just before Halloween that year, a little more than 2 months earlier. It took me a minute to figure out exactly how it was these two young men came to know one another, as many of the news articles on this case from back in the early 90s didn't specifically say. Stuart and Robert did not attend the same high school. As a matter of fact, their schools were located about 16 miles or 25 kilometers apart. Neither one of them were athletically inclined, because the academic decathlon doesn't count. They would not have crossed paths through sports or playing each other's schools. Eventually, I ran across the information that Stuart and Robert had another thing in common: a girl. When Stuart had gone to that brunch with his English teacher, he mentioned to her that he was in love for the very first time. He had a girlfriend who was also a student at Foothill High School, and her name was Jennifer Lynn. At some point previous to being in a relationship with Stuart, she had briefly dated Robert Chen. And there we have the common thread as to how these two young men became acquainted with one another. There is not a whole lot of information about Jennifer's relationship with Robert, but she had apparently shunned him or broken up with him, or was not really all that interested in being with him. But when she met Stuart, the couple hit it off and they were very much in love. I can't figure out for the life of me why Jennifer Lynn thought it would be a good idea to introduce Stuart and Robert, but she did. I don't think it's ever a good idea to introduce your new boyfriend to your old boyfriend, especially if things with the old boyfriend didn't end well, and especially if we're talking about high school kids who can be emotionally immature. Nothing about that seemed like a good idea, and there's really no explanation on her part as to the reasons why this all happened. I can't even ever say for sure that she addressed the subject publicly, and if she did, I couldn't find it. And there is very little in the way of court documents on this case too. So, if this episode is coming across kind of choppy and discombobulated, it's because there are numerous news articles about this case all over the internet with tidbits of information here and there that I'm trying to compile as best as I can in a cohesive story that flows well. And I'm really not going to be able to tell until I record, and even then I have to listen back to it. And on top of that, right now I'm feeling a little bit congested, and I'm pretty sure that's coming across, but I feel fine. I don't know, just phlegmy. It's weird. I don't know what's causing it. I think I'm allergic to people who don't pick up after their dogs. Anyway, I don't know why Jennifer brought Stuart and Robert together, but what I do know is that she never met with them, the three of them, together in person. I believe she ended up giving Stuart Robert's number, and you'll understand a little bit more why, but articles on this story say that these two young men had a plan. While some of them referred to Jennifer as Stuart's girlfriend, they didn't even really mention her by name, so it's kind of a gray area. Another thing that I was able to infer from this whole triangle of Stuart, Jennifer, and Robert is that Jennifer seems to have a type. You know, if you didn't know that Jennifer was the link between these two men, then you might consider that their crossing paths may have been something that was written in the stars. I mean, based on how much the two of them seem to have in common, both of them were honor roll students at affluent Orange County high schools, both of them with aspirations of one day attending Ivy League colleges, possibly becoming physicians, both of them described by their peers and teachers alike as being excellent when it comes to academics and extracurriculars. And then there is what others had said about both of them and their desires to be involved in criminal activity, at least talking about it a lot, bragging about their illegal exploits, their involvement with gangs. Whether the things that they had purportedly said were true or not, they were both known for it, at the very least, for talking about it. So Stuart and Robert becoming acquainted wasn't a coincidence. As it turned out, it was Jennifer who set up the meeting between the two of them. They had a lot of things in common because apparently she liked those particular qualities about them. Whatever it was that prompted Jennifer to bring them together, we may never know. Who initiated it? Was it Stuart? Was it Robert? I believe it was Stuart. And why? All we do know is that there was a plan to commit a crime, and someone wanted to gather some like-minded individuals to help pull off this crime. Now, because Jennifer and Stuart were boyfriend and girlfriend at the time, I believe that at some point, the two of them were sitting around talking about this plan, and this is a plan that was most likely hatched by Stuart. And in talking to Jennifer, he's probably said something like he needed someone that could be trusted to help him pull this off. And this goes along with what I've been saying about Stuart, wanting to be known for more than just being a straight-A honor roll student with rich parents. He wanted to be known for his self-proclaimed computer hacking skills, his weapons trafficking, and counterfeiting operations. And as for Jennifer, I mean, I can't say for sure because we just don't know, but she probably thought it was like so cool to have this boyfriend that was all into being this criminal mastermind. And just the fact that she went from Robert to Stuart, two peas in a pod if there ever was, that's what I mean by she has a type. So if Stuart started talking about pulling off this crime but needing help, I could easily see Jennifer saying, "Hey, I know a guy." And that's how I theorize Stuart and Robert came together. I'm under the impression that Robert did not know it was Jennifer that set up the meeting because it first started off with them calling each other. I believe Stuart initiated it and called Robert first. So how all of this really truly came to fruition, it's somewhat of a mystery, but that's what I've inferred from what I've read. And when the two finally did meet in person, it was just a couple of days before Halloween. It was really weird, as it was clear that neither one of them was sure that they could trust each other. As a matter of fact, they both wore Halloween masks, and neither one of them took it off during the duration of their entire meeting that first time. Where this meeting took place, how long it was, all of those details, I don't have that information. But what I do know is Stuart took the secrecy to the next level by not only giving Robert a fake name, but he also said that he was older than his actual age. He had turned 17 that December 8th of 1992. Stuart told Robert that his name was Martin Gore. Now, when I searched the name Martin Gore, I got two results. There is Martin Gore, who is the leading oncologist and cancer treatment specialist at the Royal Marsden Hospital in London. And then there is Martin Gore, one of the founding members of Depeche Mode. He is or was their main songwriter, keyboardist, guitarist, and contributed to the backup vocals. While I'm pretty sure Stuart was not inspired by the oncologist, but rather the member of Depeche Mode, I don't think he just pulled the name out of a hat. I believe I read somewhere that Depeche Mode was one of his favorite groups. And the group was still really popular at the time. I'd say that was probably his inspiration for the name. He introduced himself to Robert as a crime boss, that he had about 100 associates or soldiers or capos if we're going to use the mafia terminology. He said he was a hacker, a computer pirate, and that he manufactured fake driver's licenses and credit cards. He also told Robert that he was a weapons trafficker and he was an expert when it came to explosives. I believe he also led Robert to believe that he had killed people as well. In addition to giving Robert a fake name and a fake age, he also lied about where he lived. In order to prove to Robert that he had all of this inside information about him, to show him that he had all of these connections and whatnot, Stuart shared some personal information that he knew about Robert that he should not have known, such as where Robert lived. Stuart had his exact address. He had information about some of his personal belongings, like his clothing, things that he owned. And Stuart also told Robert that he knew about a crush that he used to have on a cheerleader at his high school. So because Stuart used this information, which I can only assume he got from his girlfriend Jennifer, that's the reason why I don't think Robert knew about Stuart's connection to her, that Stuart was actually dating his old girlfriend. So we know that Jennifer is the one who told Stuart about Robert, that he might be interested in partnering up for some criminal activity because she's heard that he's possibly had some connections to some Asian gangs, and she then provided him with some personal information about him. So Robert must not have known that Stuart was actually in a relationship with Jennifer, at least not to this point. So you can imagine what must be going through Robert's mind, that this guy that he doesn't even know somehow knows all about him, and it can make a person feel very, very uncomfortable. Today, maybe that sort of stuff and having knowledge about someone may not be as surprising because of social media and whatnot, but this was back in 1992. These kids are still carrying pagers. So Robert assumed that the only way that Stuart would have this information about him is that he was indeed as well connected as he claimed to be. And that is all Robert had to believe, regardless of it being true or not. So when Stuart told Robert all this background info that he supposedly had about him that came from his so-called mysterious connections, Robert would claim that he was feeling nervous about Stuart because he knew stuff that he really shouldn't have, so he described himself as feeling a little threatened. And the thing that Stuart wanted to do was he wanted to burglarize a computer store owner. This is a guy that had a shop and he sold parts and computers located in Anaheim. And he knew the owner of the computer store to be quite successful. And Stuart said he knew him, he knew what he knew he had these assets, and he wanted to rob him at home. Like a home invasion type of burglary where they would go in and tie up the family and take all of their valuables and money. And he wanted Robert's help with this. There was also another article that said they wanted to burglarize the store itself, but I believe that they actually wanted to get them at home. That way they could get more things, jewelry, cash, and computer parts if they had them at the house. Robert would later say that he only agreed at the time to participate in this plan because he was fearful of what Stuart knew and what he would do if he said he didn't want to help. After all, this guy, who Robert didn't even know, knew where he lived. So, Robert told Stuart that he would help out with this burglary plan. Now, at first, when I began reading into this story, I felt as though the burglary was something that both young men wanted to do. But the more I got into the details, I started thinking that it was possible that Robert was never really on board with it. Because you see, the thing is, several of the articles made it sound as though the burglary plan was a go, and that Robert was on board from the beginning with the plan. It had been reported by several news outlets that what Robert did over the next several weeks following his initial meeting with Stuart was to recruit 4 others to supposedly help out with the burglary too. But I've come to believe that it's possible that the burglary was never going to be a thing that Robert was really planning on participating in because he did not trust Stuart one bit from the moment that he met him. He was highly suspicious of him, mainly because of all that personal information that he had, but also later on when it came to light that Stuart had lied about his name and age and where he lived. How it was that Robert found out about Stuart's real name, age, and address came just a couple of weeks after they first met, after Robert had recruited several others to join him, and I'll talk about these other recruits in just a moment. But apparently at a meeting that all of these young men held, Stuart had inadvertently dropped his wallet, and someone managed to take a look at his ID and saw his real information. While I've theorized that Robert may or may not have been willing to participate in the burglary that Stuart had planned, there may have been a part of him that was entertaining the idea, but the others that he brought in on the plan, they had their doubts about Stuart from the onset, and they never really trusted him or the plan. So when they saw Stuart drop his wallet and saw his ID, that's the moment that everything changed. They started to think that they were being set up. When it was that Robert found out that Stuart had been lying to him about his name, age, and where he was from, Robert's paranoia shifted into anger. And he was thinking Stuart was some sort of crime boss. Even though Robert had tried to sell the same story about himself to Stuart, it seemed as though Robert was more inclined to believe him. I don't even know if Stuart believed Robert's stories and all that he bragged about, or if he even really cared. But Stuart was the one with the plan. He was essentially nobody to Robert, and the fact that he had all this information about him, which he used to prove that he had some sort of clout, that really caused Robert to be nervous. I'm not convinced that Robert wanted to take part in the burglary. If anything, I think Robert wanted to find out more about Stuart, and that's what all of this was about in the first place, to see if he could trust him. As it stood, I think Robert believed, at best, that Stuart was going to double-cross them if they did commit the burglary, and at worst, Stuart would throw him under the bus if they were to get caught, and he'd be the one holding the bag. Even though all the articles and news clips that I watched about this case said that Robert had recruited the 4 others to help with the burglary, I think it's likely that he recruited them for other reasons, one of them being to surround himself with people that he trusted. He wanted protection. So let me tell you about the 4 others that Robert Chan recruited. All of them were fellow students at Sunny Hills High School, I believe. He solicited the help of 16-year-old Kern Kim of Fullerton, 17-year-old Mun Kang of Fullerton, 17-year-old Charles Cho, also of Fullerton, and 16-year-old Abraham Acosta, and he was from Buena Park. According to information that came out later on, it's believed that the first person that Robert reached out to for help was Charles Cho, and it was Charles who helped Robert procure the other 3. Articles on this case describe Stuart Tay as the outlier of this group of 6. But I've come to believe that the real outlier is Abraham Acosta. You'll understand a little bit more later on in the story. I don't want to give away too much this early on. But if you notice, he's the only one out of the group that is not Chinese or Korean. Stuart is Chinese. Robert is Chinese. Jennifer, the girlfriend, is Chinese. Kern, Mun, and Charles were all Korean. And Abraham Acosta, well, I don't know his exact ethnicity or nationality. His last name has a Spanish or Portuguese origin. And I think he was specifically chosen for a reason. And you know how I brought up Adnan Syed a few minutes ago? Well, I think Robert selected Abraham Acosta for reasons that are similar to why it's been said that Adnan chose Jay Wilde to be his so-called accomplice or alibi for the day. And this would be coming from the viewpoint that Adnan is responsible for Hayes' death, which, like I said, is not up for debate in this episode. But if one is to believe that Adnan Syed is in fact guilty of murdering Hay, then the story that goes along with that theory is that Adnan chose Jay Wilde to help him cover up the crime and to help him bury Hay because Adnan would not be able to get any of his Muslim friends or high school friends to help him. That he picked up Jay because he was known to be a drug dealer, he was a little bit shady, he was likely willing to help, perhaps because he was black. Whatever Adnan's reasons may have been, he picked someone who was not a star athlete, he was not a star student, he was not devoutly religious or connected to Adnan's religion in any way. And maybe Adnan thought if it came down to it, he would be able to pin the murder on Jay and that people would believe him because he was the excellent student and the track star from a good religious family as opposed to Jay, who was a drug dealer with maybe some scrapes with the law. Adnan and Jay were not close friends. So if Jay were to go down for Hayes' murder, and it was in fact Adnan who did it, he wouldn't care. Jay was nobody to him. And to reiterate, this is if we look at this through the lens of Adnan being the one to plan and carry out Hayes' murder. I believe Abraham Acosta was chosen for similar reasons, and you will come to understand why as we unravel this case. I don't know exactly how many meetings these 6 guys ended up having that were purportedly for planning out this burglary. And like I said, I don't know if the meetings for Robert were meant to plan the burglary or meant to try and figure out more information about Stuart. As I had mentioned above, it was at one of these meetings that Stuart accidentally dropped his wallet, and unbeknownst to him, his true identity was revealed to whomever happened to see it fall to the ground. It doesn't appear that Stuart thought anything of it, nor does it seem that he was called out about his lies at the time, because once that meeting was over, the plan between the 5 friends suddenly changed. At first, it seemed as though Robert was somewhat convinced that Stuart was involved in some of the things that he had claimed. After all, how did he have all that private information about him? But that still didn't mean that he trusted the guy. But there was that part of him, perhaps, that wanted to be involved in whatever he thought Stuart was involved in. The other 4 were apparently never really convinced. So when that wallet fell, that was exactly the opportunity that they were looking for to completely convince Robert that this guy Stuart was up to no good and was probably going to get them in a lot of trouble. What kinds of trouble that they thought Stuart was going to get them into, I have no clue. But I tend to believe very little of what Stuart's saying. Did he want to be a crime boss, a weapons trafficker, an explosives expert, a counterfeiter? Perhaps, but it also sounded like that maybe he watched a lot of movies and romanticized that type of lifestyle. I mean, he had already succeeded at school. He was on track to a successful career in his future, whatever he wanted to do with his life. He's got rich parents, he's got money, he's got nice cars. While I don't want to downplay the hard work that Stuart put into his academics, it's probably one of those things where his life's path was already laid out for him by his mom and dad. He had lived up to their expectations, and they rewarded him handsomely for his successes. And with that, he was just bored and boring. So he wanted to create this other side of him to impress people. Whether or not any of it's true, I don't know. I tend to think not. Because look, if he was all that he said that he was, then why would Stuart need to hit up his girlfriend to get her ex-boyfriend to help him? Whatever the case was, everything changed as soon as the group got a glimpse of Stuart's ID in his wallet. When it was finally revealed that Stuart had lied about his name and age, that is when Robert for sure knew or felt that this was all some sort of a setup. I don't think he was ever 100% convinced that the burglary plot was ever going to come to fruition, nor do I think he was ever convinced that Stuart was on the up and up at any point in time. But the whole ID thing, that erased any doubt. And Robert went from being skeptical to being incredibly angry. Angry that he was being conned, even though he wasn't exactly being truthful about his criminal exploits either. I guess, if anything, he hadn't lied to Stuart about who he was and the fact that he was in high school. Any plans to do any further business with Stuart were quashed, and a new plan was hatched. On December 30th, 1992, a neighbor of Abraham Acosta noticed that he, along with two other Asian kids, were digging a hole in the ground in Abraham's backyard. I don't know if the neighbor questioned Abraham, if the neighbor knew him well enough to be asking, or if the boys noticed the neighbor watching them. But whatever the case was, they apparently explained that the purpose of the hole was to bury a dog. The following afternoon, on the 31st, New Year's Eve, sometime around 4 p.m., Stuart left his home, telling his sister that he was going out for a while to run an errand. He'd be home in just a little bit. He drove off in a red 1990 Nissan 300ZX that he had just received as a birthday gift a little more than 3 weeks earlier. And after that, Stuart never returned home. The errand Stuart was off to run was to meet with Robert and Kern at a Denny's in Buena Park, ostensibly to discuss the plans for the burglary, but to also discuss the purchase of a gun. The gun was supposed to have been at Abraham Acosta's house, so after the meeting at Denny's, they were to drive over to his house separately, where Stuart was told he was going to meet Robert there in Abraham's garage where the gun was being stored. I believe Stuart was under the impression that he was only going to meet with Robert at this time, but Robert had no intentions of meeting with Stuart alone. Robert would later say that he was in so much fear for his life that he had the other four waiting there at Abraham's house to protect himself. But I believe that they were all there to ambush Stuart, not primarily for Robert's safety. This was a plan. Waiting for them to arrive, along with Abraham, was Mun Kang and Charles Cho. Kern Kim acted as a lookout. Stuart, remember, had only expected to be meeting with Robert. When Stuart entered Abraham's garage, he saw the others there too, awaiting his arrival. They apparently exchanged pleasantries, and then Stuart was handed a metal lockbox that he was told contained a gun. Stuart fidgeted with the box to get it open to take a look at the gun, and it was then the boys launched their attack. Suddenly and without warning, one of them took a sledgehammer and smashed it into Stuart's shoulder blade. He never saw this coming. As Stuart began to stumble after the blow, it was later reported that he said something along the lines of, "What did I ever do to you?" The sledgehammer was swung into Stuart's back several more times, and then another one of the boys, armed with a baseball bat, also began bludgeoning Stuart until he became unconscious on the cold cement floor of the garage. Blood had been splattered everywhere. As Stuart lay crumpled on the ground, it became apparent to the boys who had attacked him that he wasn't dead yet. So according to what the others later stated, it was Robert who found a bottle of rubbing alcohol, poured it down Stuart's throat, with much of it ending up in Stuart's lungs, and then they wrapped duct tape around his head and covered his mouth and nose. At some point, Stuart vomited and ultimately choked on it. It was later determined that if Stuart had not choked and suffocated on his own vomit, in addition to having his breathing cut off because of the duct tape, that it was nearly 100% certain that he would have died as a result of the head injuries he sustained from being bludgeoned with the sledgehammer and the bat. Essentially, Stuart was killed 3 times over. It was brutal. The boys then dragged Stuart's lifeless body from the garage to the backyard where they had prepared the grave the day before, and they unceremoniously buried him. Another aspect of the planning of this crime was the purchase of a box of latex gloves for everyone to wear as they would next clean up the crime scene and get rid of evidence. And in addition to that planning, they also rehearsed this crime, the actual killing itself, several times before they actually pulled it off. From there, they took Stuart's car and drove it to the city of Compton, California, where it was abandoned near a busy intersection. They left the doors open and the keys in the ignition, and I read another report that said that they left the car running. It did not take long for Stuart's vehicle to disappear from the spot where they had left it, which is exactly what they had hoped would happen. The car was later recovered, but investigators did say it was lucky that the boys didn't think to put Stuart's body in the trunk of the vehicle, because it is likely that they may have never found the car or his remains. Like, can you imagine stealing a car, the doors were unlocked and the keys were right there, the engine running, just asking to be stolen, only to later discover the car had a dead body in the trunk? It would be highly unlikely that that person who stole the car was going to take it to the police to report the dead body. Investigators did find it to be quite baffling that these kids would choose to bury the body in one of their backyards like that, which seemed like such a stupid idea. But I do think that it was a little more well thought out than people really gave them credit for, and by them I mean the Asian kids in this group, not Abraham Acosta, the guy whose backyard they put his body in. Yes, it was a really stupid thing to do, but you will soon see, as I had alluded to earlier, that Abraham was chosen for a reason, and I will explain that as we go along here. Earlier in this story, I mentioned that Stuart Tay never missed a meal at home for dinner. Even though it was New Year's Eve, I assume his mom, Linda Tay, expected him to be back in time for dinner, as he always was. He said he would be back, and he wasn't much of a partier to begin with. She tried paging Stuart. Pagers were totally a big thing at the time, cell phones not so much yet. But Stuart never returned his mom's pages. Linda Tay tried getting in touch with some of her son's friends, but nobody had heard from him. Nobody seemed to know where he went or where he was. Around 9 p.m., Stuart's mom started to become really worried. I heard that it was a little bit later in the evening into the small hours of the morning when Stuart's mom finally called the Orange police to report her son missing, insisting that it was very unusual for him to not return her pages. He didn't like to party. He was supposed to be home. Because it would later be revealed that Linda and Alfred Tay would hire a private investigator almost immediately following Stuart's disappearance, it kind of leads me to believe that maybe police weren't taking Stuart's disappearance very seriously because it was, after all, New Year's Eve. But then, Since the Tays clearly had the resources, they could have decided on a private investigator in order to make sure that they were doing everything that they could to find Stuart as quickly as possible, not wanting to solely rely on the police to do their jobs thoroughly. It's not often that a private investigator is brought in so early on, but in this case, the Tays were on top of it right away. And since we're talking about the private investigator right now, I'm going to bring up a theory that he raised about why this crime happened in the first place. He quickly found out about the link between Stuart Tay and Robert Chan being their girlfriend, Jennifer Lynn, and he opined that this was a crime of passion, so to speak. Jealousy over Jennifer on Robert's part, who had for a short time dated her, but then subsequently became involved with Stuart, and their relationship had become much more serious than her relationship with Robert had been. But it was soon into the investigation that it was found out that she was the one that connected the two in the first place. But as I said, I don't know if Robert knew it was through Jennifer that Stuart became aware of him, or that was how he knew all the private and personal information that she had, because it seemed as though he attributed Stuart's knowledge of him to something or someone other than Jennifer, and was immediately suspicious of Stuart. If he had known it was Jennifer, he might not have been so suspicious, but I don't think he knew it was her. However, according to the official police investigation on this case, they received information that Robert was unaware that Stuart was Jennifer Lynn's boyfriend, because one of the co-conspirators said that it wasn't until Robert got a hold of Stuart's wallet after they killed him, and in going through it, that's when he saw that Stuart had kept a photograph of Jennifer in his wallet. The police investigators on the case believe that that's when he found out about the connection, and likely realized it was Jennifer who fed Stuart all of those details about him. So because Robert was unaware of Jennifer and Stuart's relationship, police did not believe that would have been the motive for Stuart's murder. It was also revealed, as I had mentioned earlier, Stuart and the other five, Robert, Kern, Munn, Charles, and Abraham, that Stuart was not well acquainted with any of them at all. The only reason Stuart linked up with these guys was his desire to commit that home invasion robbery. In conversations Jennifer had with Stuart, there came a time when she mentioned Robert Chan to him, and she said that he had ties to Hua Qing. And Hua Qing is a Chinese gang that was founded in San Francisco, California, sometime during the first half of the 1960s, and they are known to have ties with the Bloods. While Hua Qing literally translates to Chinese youth, there are members of this gang who are Asian but not Chinese. The members of the gang usually wear regular clothing, sometimes business casual, in order to make it difficult to tell them apart from everyday people, so they don't have distinguishing styles or colors that they adhere to. When their leader of the gang, a guy named Danny Wong, was killed in 1991 by a rival gang called Wu Hop 2, the remaining members of Hua Qing, most of them anyway, defected to that gang. A year later, in 1992, the same year that our story today takes place, the San Francisco Police Department began to crack down on the drug dealing and the merchant shop extortion and the illegal backroom gambling that the gang was known for. So the members of Hua Qing who had joined up with Wu Hop 2 branched off and founded a new gang based in the Chinatown district of San Francisco, and they named that gang the Jackson Street Boys, where they continued to carry on with the same illegal activities, just on a smaller scale. Hua Qing had long been in conflict with a couple of rival gangs, the Asian Boys and the Vietnamese Boys, and eventually decided to move their quote-unquote headquarters from San Francisco to the Southern California area. Hua Qing, to some law enforcement agencies, is considered to be a political terrorist group because of their strong ties to numerous organized crime affiliates, including the Triads in Hong Kong. The investigation into the claims that Robert had ties to Hua Qing revealed that about 2 months prior to Stuart's murder, Robert, along with about a half dozen other young Asian men, paid a visit to the home of another student who attended Sunny Hills High School. They had heard that this person had disrespected watching, so they went over there and demanded that he come outside. He told them no, so then they threatened to open fire on his house. Eventually, he did come outside, and Robert and the others that he was with proceeded to beat this guy up. They finally stopped when they noticed the victim's sister watching. They got back in their cars and they left. This young man that they attacked never pressed charges, and it's easy to understand why. But this attack on this student who was supposedly disrespecting watching is really the only reason Robert is said to have possibly been connected to the gang. There was no other information or confirmation that he was ever officially a member of the gang itself. Police investigated, but they found nothing more than just these kids talking about being affiliated. Just some boastful talking, most likely. Now, according to Orange County investigators, what tends to set Asian gangs apart from other street gangs, aside from the conservative manner in which they dress, is the fact that most members tend to continue to live normal, productive lives. They excel in school, they often go on to good colleges, and they hold down decent jobs. Also, in an article I read on this case in the Chicago Tribune, at the time these gang members also didn't get any tattoos that illustrated any type of gang association, nor did they tag their neighborhoods with graffiti. Unlike most other gangs, the Asian gangs aren't all that interested in marking their turf, but rather they want to build up their criminal enterprises, whether it be extortion or gambling or drugs. They're also known to have committed murders, but also robberies and burglaries, the latter of which is what put Stuart Tay and Robert Chan on that collision course. It probably isn't hard to guess that it only took a couple of days for all 5 co-conspirators to be taken into custody and charged with Stuart's murder. And it is believed that Robert Chan's anger about being lied to, his suspicion that Stuart was setting him up to be double-crossed, that was the catalyst for what ultimately happened. Investigators quickly named Robert as the mastermind of the murder. He would be the only one out of the 5 who refused to make any statements to police when arrested. But the others, they were pretty quick to make their statements. While how much or how little of what each of them said was the truth, I can imagine that all 4 of them quickly rolled over on Robert so fast to save their own butts. I watched a news clip about this case on YouTube, and the officials on it, in speaking to the media following these boys' arrest, started throwing around the threat of seeking the death penalty, which, when I watched this, sounded absolutely preposterous to me. For the officials to even get on TV and in the media to say that they were going to seek the ultimate punishment for a bunch of kids. With the exception of Robert, who was the only one who was 18 at the time, they were all minors. But, this was 28 years ago, right? Almost 28 years. The law has not always been on the side of youthful offenders. They could have still been sentencing children to life in prison, possibly even death, without even batting an eyelash. That wouldn't happen today, nor do I think county officials would be getting on TV to announce that they're going to seek the death penalty on a bunch of teenagers. While you listening might think, oh, that's just a ploy or a scare tactic to get these kids to roll over fast on one another, and that may very well be true, I don't even think that they needed to do that. I think these kids probably figured out that they were in some deep poop. These were all seemingly really good kids, excellent students from good homes with the exception of Abraham Acosta. Remember I told you he was the outlier, and I'll get more into that in a moment. In a nutshell, the Chicago Tribune outlined the timeline of the investigation, and it went pretty quickly. After Stuart left his home for the last time on December 31st, 1992, that was around 4 p.m. when he had told his sister he was going to run an errand. The report that I had first read on this report said that Stuart's mom had called after he had been missing about 5 hours or so, but according to the Chicago Tribune, she called to report him missing around 2:40 the following morning on January 1st, 1993. Later that same day, into the evening, at around 9:50 p.m., Compton police reported finding Stuart's missing car, and it was abandoned and had been completely stripped and left in an alleyway. The following day, investigators spoke to a friend of Stuart's who told them about a plan that he had to purchase a gun from a guy named Robert Chan, and that they had plans to meet at a local restaurant the afternoon of New Year's Eve around 4 p.m. Within 2 days of that, on January 4th, the Tay family's private investigator provided police with the information that led them to Kern Kim, and when he was questioned, he eventually told them that he and his friends had met Stuart at a house in Buena Park, and while he was the lookout, they quote-unquote took care of Stuart in the garage. Within hours of Kern's admissions, detectives went to Abraham's house, and from there, they were told that he and some of his friends were recently seen digging a hole in the backyard to bury a dog. Officers on the scene did note some recently disturbed dirt in the yard. Just after 12 p.m. that same day, Abraham, Moon, and Robert were arrested. Charles was taken into custody a short time later. Kern was already in custody. Robert did not provide a statement to police at the time, but everyone else did, and the details of the crime were revealed by 9 p.m. that night, and a search warrant for Abraham Acosta's property had been obtained, and under the glare of floodlights, Stuart Tay was removed from the shallow grave in which he'd been placed. In making their statements to police, the suspects who did talk to investigators after they were taken into custody, they said that the plan had been several weeks in the making, and all of it was going to go down at Abraham's house. When Stuart arrived, he came into the garage. It was Mun Kang who handed Stuart the metal box, which he thought contained a handgun that he wanted to purchase, but the box did not contain a gun. While Stuart was looking at the box and messing with the latch to get it open, Robert and Abraham began pummeling Stuart with a sledgehammer and a baseball bat. The beating lasted approximately 20 minutes, and Stuart was alive for all of it. At times, he'd even begged for them to spare his life. But the two boys never let up. When Stuart fell unconscious, that is when they stopped hitting him, but realized that he was still alive. It was reported to investigators that Abraham was heard saying that Stuart was taking too long to die. I think I've talked about this in the past, but it isn't as easy as it sounds to beat somebody to death. You think it's going to be fast and easy with weapons like a sledgehammer and a bat, but remember, they started off by hitting Stuart in the back. There's nothing back there that they're going to strike that's going to be immediately fatal or render Stuart unconscious. He's going to feel every blow, and none of them are going to do much damage that's going to cause Stuart's death all that quickly. And on top of that, of course, Stuart is young and healthy and strong, and obviously, as none of these kids has any criminal history to speak of, and most likely had not been in too many serious fights, if any at all, previously, much less had any of them ever killed anyone, they're not really going to know what they're doing, even though they supposedly rehearsed this whole thing. Again, it sounds like a bunch of kids who watched movies or TV and figured a sledgehammer would do the job fast. But they didn't know what they were doing. Of course, it doesn't lessen the brutality of what they put Stuart through in his final moments. And for Robert Chan to come up with the idea of pouring the rubbing alcohol down his throat, and that wasn't really being swallowed by Stuart, it was being inhaled into his lungs because that's where they found it, and then putting that duct tape over his mouth and his nose, all of that is just really gruesome and painful, and there's no doubt about that Stuart suffered tremendously. Once Stuart was dead, they wrapped his body in some bed linens and they buried him in that shallow grave that they had prepared the day before at Abraham's backyard. When that was finished, Abraham used his garden hose to wash the blood from the garage, but, this was an extremely amateurish job and there was so much blood evidence left behind for investigators to uncover anyway. At the time of their arrest, one of the officers who was in the station while the boys were sitting there waiting to be booked was watching them and studying their faces, to see if he could read anything as to what they were thinking. And to this officer, he said he really didn't see very much. He didn't think these kids realized the gravity of what they had done. They all just seemed to have these blank expressions on their faces. One of them even expressed concern about some homework he needed to get done over the winter break. According to the reports from law enforcement, once the boys were done burying Stuart and ditching his car in Compton, they found that Stuart had several $100s in his wallet, likely to make that gun purchase. So they divvied up the cash. And remember, this is New Year's Eve, so what is one to do after one commits a brutal homicide on a celebratory day such as this? You go to a New Year's Eve party, apparently. That's exactly what Robert, Moon, and Charles, the eldest of the 5, did. They went to a party. Abraham went to Knott's Berry Farm the next day. Totally okay with a dead body being in his backyard, but whatever. You gotta get to Camp Snoopy, I guess. Anyway, in speaking to the kids as the investigation was going on, it was revealed that Robert, apparently who masterminded this plot to murder Stuart, they said it was he who got upset with Stuart, that he suspected that he was setting him up to be double-crossed or using him to take the fall for the burglary should the time come, and that it was Stuart who began recruiting all of the others. I don't know for sure, but Robert may have recruited some of the boys earlier to possibly take part in the home invasion burglary, and then later, with some of their help, recruited a couple more, including Abraham Acosta, when Robert decided that he wanted Stuart dead. According to Abraham, Robert offered him $200 to help him get rid of someone. Those were his exact words. Abraham said that Robert was the one who came to his house with a number of shovels and told him and 2 others to start digging the hole the day before the killing. Abraham also said that it was Robert who gave him the signal when it was time to start beating Stuart with the sledgehammer. So it was actually Abraham who held the sledgehammer. He inflicted the initial blows, at which point Robert grabbed a baseball bat and joined in. According to Kern Kim's statement, he was the one who drove Stuart's car, and it was Robert Chan who provided him with the latex gloves so he wouldn't get any fingerprints in it. Mun Kang said that Robert Chan was the one who ordered him to take off his bloody clothing and to put on something else. Charles Cho said it was Robert Chan who took the key pieces of evidence, the baseball bat, the sledgehammer, the lockbox that Stuart had been holding, along with Stuart's wallet, and got rid of everything. Where he disposed of those items is unknown, and none of it was ever recovered. So, as you can see here, the co-conspirators are talking to investigators, and independent of each other, they are portraying Robert as the ringleader and themselves as the unwitting patsies. And that would become the basis of their defense. Investigators didn't think it was going to be easy for these other 4 kids to pin all of this on Robert, likely thinking that they were going to somehow get off with a slap on the wrist or possibly even skate altogether. Seeing as they all willingly participated in the planning and the rehearsing of the thing, it was highly unlikely that any of them would be getting off without serving a significant amount of jail time. So, Abraham Acosta, the outsider, the only one of these 6 kids that was not of Asian descent. I explained that I got the feeling that Abraham was to Robert as Jay Wilde was to Adnan Syed. At least that is my opinion of his role in all of this. Adnan needed help from someone who was not closely affiliated with him either through school or friends or his Muslim community or the mosque that he attended. He needed someone sort of on the fringes of his social circle. Someone who he really did not care if he got in trouble or not for what he was planning on doing, and again, that's if you're in the Adnan is guilty camp, or at the very least, guilty but unfairly convicted. I think Robert Chan wanted to dispose of Stuart someplace outside of his affluent Sunny Hills community, someone who was not Asian, someone who would most likely take the fall for the murder that he didn't care about, should it come to that. Because you've got to be thinking, how stupid was it to agree to allow these rich Asian kids to bury a body in your backyard? Well, I question whether or not Abraham even attended Sunny Hills High School. It turns out that he did, but he was in the school special education program. As a matter of fact, when he was being booked, he informed the police that he did not know how to read. According to the Chicago Tribune, when Abraham was Mirandized, they'll read off all of these rights. So to make sure it's clear, the officer reading the Miranda rights will say, "You have the right to remain silent. Do you understand?" 99.9% of the time, the person in custody will say yes. Not Abraham. He said that he did not understand. They had to clarify to him that having the right to remain silent meant that he did not have to talk to police right then and there if he didn't want to. When they told Abraham that he had the right to an attorney, they needed to explain that an attorney was a synonym for a lawyer. While Abraham was eventually assigned a public defender, she would later describe him as slow. But investigators called BS, claiming that, quote, "he isn't as stupid as they're making him out to be." And that came directly from somebody close to the case. But either way, I don't think it's up to any of them, either the police or the attorney, to decide what Abraham is or is not capable of. First off, I don't think the police should have been publicly calling him stupid. And secondly, Abraham's cognitive abilities should have been evaluated by a professional before any conclusions were reached. After all, they knew that he was in the special education program. He said that he couldn't read, and none of that means that he's stupid. To me, I think it means that he was specifically chosen by Robert because of those weaknesses. It was someone Robert saw as vulnerable, someone that he could easily manipulate, somebody that he could talk into burying a body in his backyard, somebody who to Robert was dispensable. It was easy to order Abraham around, and it doesn't excuse away Abraham's culpability in all of this. I mean, after all, he did agree to take part. But none of this means he didn't realize what he was doing was wrong. But I don't think Abraham would have gone along unless he was talked into it. Because let's be real, I would bet anything that none of those other boys would ever agree to allow Stuart's body to be buried in their backyard. Not a chance. It probably wasn't even possible. If their homes were as nice and well manicured as Stuart's, they could have never gotten it past their parents. But Abraham, that was their best chance, I guess. The other three boys, Kern Kim, Mun Kang, and Charles Ko, as I mentioned earlier, they were all Korean American. And the Korean community was quick to blame the boys' actions on being Americanized and a lack of morals. And I'm going to disagree with that assessment. While that may be the opinion of the Korean community, unless Korea itself is completely void of brutality and violence because of strong moral standards and teachings, I'm not going to buy it. It is not uncommon for young people to get caught up in illegal activities because of poverty. Often they are raised in rough neighborhoods, their families struggle to make ends meet, and for some, the solution is to begin committing crimes, sometimes joining gangs. These kids in this case, they had it all, literally. The Korean community can't blame poverty or the struggles that come along with being impoverished. So instead, they're pointing the finger to Americanization of these boys and being taught in a place that lacks moral values. Kern Kim, according to the Chicago Tribune, his family was one of the most prominent and well-known Korean American families in the Orange County area. Like Stuart, his father was also a doctor, and his mother was known throughout the community for her philanthropy and volunteerism. As a matter of fact, one of Kern's family members, in speaking to the media about him, said that he was just as much of a victim as Stuart and was in the wrong place at the wrong time, which to me is such a weak excuse. But information came out later that a friend of Kern's overheard him and Robert talking about getting rid of a dead body about a week before Stuart's murder. And then the following day, on New Year's Day, the friend reported that Kern spent that entire day playing video games. Kern admitted to police that his role in all of this was that of the lookout. As for Charles Cho, when he was interrogated, he admitted that he was inside the garage when the beating on Stuart began, and he did assist in carrying the body from the garage to the grave. At the time of the murder, Charles had been a volunteer at the YMCA, at their child care facility, no less. He was a part of the Sunny Hills High School Elite International College Undergraduate Program, and like the others, he too had his sights on the Ivy League. Mun Kang, as for him, there wasn't much mention of his background or academics in the media, but his friends described him as a nice, laid-back guy. And he, at first, attempted to deny having any part in the murder, claiming that he had no idea who Stuart Tay was, which isn't far from the truth, but it doesn't necessarily mean that he didn't have anything to do with his death. Lots of killers don't know their victims. It doesn't mean they didn't do it or take part. But there came a point when police went ahead and let Mun talk to Kern in an interrogation room alone, and it was at that point he started talking and fessing up. It was likely that police were watching and recording the conversation anyway, but as the two friends talked, it was after that conversation that Mun went ahead and confessed to his role in what happened to Stuart. He told investigators that he was the one who handed Stuart the box that they claimed contained the gun that he wanted to purchase. He also admitted to helping move Stuart's body from the garage to the backyard. Now, everyone is entitled to their opinions on this, including myself, and I'm going to stick by what I said at the beginning of this. People are capable of anything. I don't care how prestigious the families of these kids are that they came from, how many points they scored on their SATs, how many college acceptance letters that they would have received. None of that means anything to me, and the crime having been committed by these kids doesn't surprise me one single bit. The brutality kind of surprises me, but I could also attribute that to desperation or panic, possibly even wanting to show off on Robert's part, to show his friends that he is as violent and as brutal as he's claimed to have been. But all in all, none of these guys really strike me as particularly criminal-minded, but again, their actions don't shock me. I also don't buy into any of the excuses their supporters made for them on their behalf. I don't think being Americanized caused them to murder. I don't think a lack of moral teachings in school had anything to do with it either. And I certainly don't think anyone was in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was planned, and it sounds like everybody showed up as scheduled because they wanted to be there. Aside from the killing itself, one of the more perplexing aspects of this case was the number of fellow students and friends who seemed to be in the know about a murder being planned and nobody having come forward to say anything about it to anyone. No one who heard talks of a murder and disposing of a body ever reported it or did anything to try to stop it, and those who knew about it afterwards never contacted police, never talked to the school officials, didn't tell their parents. They didn't tell anybody come forward with any information. Investigators had to go around and get all this information out of everyone, and it was really shocking just how many people had heard about this in advance and heard about the aftermath. While it can be surprising, I just think it was probably one of those things that nobody really took seriously as they started hearing murmurings about murder or hiding a dead body, and then after the fact, maybe nobody believed it, or perhaps they stayed quiet out of fear. The crime was very brutal, and the fact that it was planned out over a period of time, I think it's easy to lose sight of the fact that we're talking about a bunch of kids here. According to the Chicago Tribune article, there was a kid named Greg Temsavari who was friends with each of the boys from Sunny Hills that was involved in this crime. He was one of the ones that overheard Robert and Kern talking about getting rid of a body, and he heard Abraham discussing killing someone. Kern also had spoken to Greg over the phone about Stuart's murder right after it happened, and it was actually the Tays private investigator who found out about Greg and what he knew and had spoken to him, as well as several other friends of theirs. The private investigator took that information to police, who in turn hauled Greg into the station for an interview on January 4th, 1993. That is when police found out the names of who was involved in this. Greg had even told police that as soon as he had heard the news that Stuart had gone missing, he knew right away what had happened and who did it. He said that he was afraid to say anything based solely on the fact that Stuart was killed only for telling a lie about his name and age, and this caused him to be fearful for his own safety. He wanted to have nothing to do with it. And he basically said the same thing that we've been saying all along here, that it is not surprising that these rich kids were planning a robbery. It reminds me of the Menendez brothers who got caught robbing their friends' homes. It's just a thing to do for a thrill, just to get away with it, not for any monetary gain, just because they can. Greg also admitted that if he had been there, which could have been a possibility if not for the fact that he was on vacation at the time, he may have been involved too. But that would have been him being in the wrong place at the wrong time, he says. And he also admitted that if he was, he would probably not have done anything to stop the murder from happening. And dreamers, I am so over this wrong place, wrong time crap. It's like because you're there, because you want to be there, plain and simple. There is no such thing as being in the wrong place at the wrong time when someone is getting killed and you were in the know about it. But anyway, it didn't take long for the 5 suspects to be rounded up by police. Some of the information had come from fellow students at Sunny Hills, and some of the information had come from the Tays private investigator. In the end, Charles Coe and Mun Kang decided to plead guilty to first-degree murder. Both of them were 17 years old at the time. Charles was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, but he was ordered to serve his time at the California Youth Authority. Since he was sentenced as a juvenile per the terms of his plea, he would be getting out when he turned 25, making his time at the Youth Authority a total of 8 years. He would also be required to testify as a key witness in any of the cases that made it to trial. As for Mun Kang, he also pleaded guilty and agreed to testify as well. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, but he was going to serve his time in regular adult prison. I could not find any information about how long he served or when he was paroled, but in a search of California inmates revealed nobody by his name currently incarcerated in the state. On July 1st, 1994, both Kern Kim and Abraham Acosta, who decided to take their chances going to trial, were both convicted of first-degree murder. Abraham, who was 16 years old at the time the murder took place, he was also sent to the California Youth Authority, and he was released when he turned 25 also. Kern was sentenced to 25 years to life. He had at least one time been denied parole because it was believed he was not being truthful about his part in the murder. However, in 2011, then California Governor Jerry Brown overturned that decision, and the following year, in December of 2012, Kern was released on parole. It was shown that he had been a model prisoner for 20 years. He was able to show that he had a low risk of reoffending. He took full responsibility for his actions regarding Stuart's murder. It was also highlighted that Kern had no previous criminal convictions in his background. There was never any issues with drug or alcohol or gang affiliation. And while he was in prison, he completed his education. He earned a college degree. He was never disciplined, and he received glowing reports from the prison administration. Today, Kern is an activist, working for change in the criminal justice system when it comes to the prosecution and sentencing of juveniles, and he has helped affect some change in California legislation. In an article in newsandreview.com, Kern talked about his life before all of this happened, stating, quote, I was in the National Honor Society. I was a son of a doctor with aspirations to follow in his footsteps to medical school. I was pretty much a garden variety nerd, a model minority kid. But what Kern describes as one dumb decision, that's when his life went off the rails. He speaks publicly and openly about his experiences, and he points out that he was not a participant in the crime itself, but as the law is written, he was just as responsible as those who swung the bat, those who brought down the sledgehammer, those who dug the grave, and those who buried the body. He says that his role was to be a lookout, and it was his belief that Stuart was the one who was about to go to police and rat them all out for planning a home invasion burglary. Kern also addresses something that I talked about earlier, and it has to do with the denial that the Korean community preferred to be nestled in, rather than acknowledging the real problems that their kids can and have potentially gotten into. Kern attributes that to being an issue of cultural pride, the refusal or inability to talk about troubled youth within the Korean community who have been plagued with problems including gang activity, drugs, going to jail, etc. That all that does is perpetuate the myth that Asian kids are model students and model citizens, that all they ever do is overachieve and they never get in any trouble. And dreamers, I don't know about you, but I've never really bought into that myth. We all knew back in high school those wealthy honor roll kids were also very much capable of getting into lots of trouble too. These kids in our story today just happened to get caught before they were able to go away to their Ivy Leagues. But anyway, Kern's family stood firmly by him and supported him throughout his incarceration, and he says he's doing the best that he can to make up for everything that he put them through. And he's doing so through fighting for reform and activism, which is one bright spot in this whole entire thing. As for Robert Chan, well, things were going to go differently for him no matter what, based purely on the fact that his age was 1 and 2 digits higher than everyone else's. He was the only one who was 18 years old when Stuart was murdered. On top of that, he was also signaled out as the mastermind of the whole thing, and that is an accusation that he vehemently denied. But he did take the stand in his own defense, and he basically told the jury it was a kill or be killed type of a thing. That he was under the strong belief that Stuart Tay had rigged his house with deadly explosives, that Stuart was out to kill him, so he had to kill him first in order to save his own life and the lives of his family. The jury didn't exactly see it that way, even going so far as to view that testimony on the stand as a confession in open court. Stuart did what he could to shift the blame onto everyone else, but the jury strongly believed that if not for Robert Chan, Stuart Tay would have been alive today. Robert was convicted of first-degree murder about 2 months before Kern and Abraham were in May of 1994. It didn't take the jury very long. As they said, the prosecutor said it best in the closing arguments. He's basically convicted himself when he got up there on the stand. Robert Chan was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Today, he's 45 years old. He's been in prison for half his life and then some 28 years. It'll be 28 years this December 31st since these young men decided Stuart Tay needed to die. As of today, Robert Chan is the only one of these 5 individuals involved in Stuart's murder that is still in prison, and he will remain there for the rest of his life. The overwhelming theme in much that has been written about this case is why. Why these kids who had the world at their feet? Why would they resort to the crime that they had been planning and ultimately committed? But I think the overwhelming theme of this entire episode is the answers really aren't all that complicated. And that will bring this 163rd episode of California Dreaming to a close. Please come over to our Facebook discussion group if you haven't done so yet and request to join. It's there that we discuss these cases that we cover. We share our thoughts and opinions, not just about California Dreaming, but any podcasts that you listen to, documentaries that you've watched, or books that you've recently read, or current news stories. This week or this weekend, we seem to be posting some pretty good looking recipes. We also post funny memes, so please come and share. You can also go over to the show's Facebook page and like that page and leave a review or a recommendation. You can also follow the show on Twitter at CaliforniaPod and Instagram at CaliforniaDreamingPod. California Dreaming is brought to you by the Orbital Jigsaw Network, a podcast production company on a mission to create some of the best podcasts to listen to. And we have an amazing roster of shows with content that covers true crime, history, sports entertainment, gaming, and social media. So visit our website at www.orbitaljigsaw.com. That's where you'll find all the links to our podcast, as well as a direct link to our merchandise store on TeePublic. Again, that's www.orbitaljigsaw.com. Thank you so much for listening. I'm your host, Roseanne, and until next time, sweet dreams, and please pick up after your dog. Don't be nasty. Pick up your dog's poop. Thank you.